1,000 feet below the surface of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, in tunnels so narrow you couldn't turn around, men drilled copper out of solid rock using nothing but a hand drill and a 4-pound hammer. No machines, no electricity, no ventilation. Just a candle stuck to the wall with clay and the sound of steel hitting rock. They worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that reached 130 degrees. The water that seeped through the rock was so hot it blistered skin on contact. This is what copper mining looked like before machines. And the copper they pulled out, by hand, built the electrical grid that powered America. Most people have never heard of the Keweenaw Peninsula. It's a finger of land jutting into Lake Superior, about as far north as you can go in Michigan without crossing into Canada. Cold, remote, covered in pine forest and snow for half the year. Winter temperatures drop to 30 below zero. Blizzards bury entire towns. The growing season lasts maybe 90 days if you're lucky. The isolation is profound. Even today, it feels like the edge of the world. Nobody would choose to live there unless there was something worth the suffering. But beneath that frozen ground lay something that would reshape the modern world. Native copper. Pure metallic copper. Not locked inside ore that needed smelting, but actual chunks of metal embedded in basalt rock. Some pieces weighed tons. The Ojibwe people had been pulling copper from this land for thousands of years, hammering it into tools and jewelry and trading it across the continent. Copper artifacts from the Keweenaw have been found as far away as Florida and the Gulf Coast, evidence of trade networks that spanned the continent long before Europeans arrived. The Ojibwe understood something the white settlers would learn the hard way. This copper came at a price. The spirits of the land demanded respect. You didn't just take from the earth without consequence. The settlers didn't believe in spirits. They believed in profit. And then, in the 1840s, America realized it needed copper. Desperately. The telegraph was coming. Samuel Morse had demonstrated his electric telegraph in 1844, sending a message from Washington to Baltimore that changed everything. Within years, every city in America wanted to be connected. Businessmen wanted to know market prices instantly. Newspapers wanted to report events as they happened. The government wanted to communicate with distant territories. Telegraph lines needed wire. Wire needed copper. And there wasn't enough copper being produced anywhere in the country to meet the demand. The young nation was hungry for connection, hungry for speed, hungry for the technology that would bind its scattered settlements into something that felt like a unified country. So when geologists surveyed the Keweenaw Peninsula and found copper deposits unlike anything seen before, the rush began. The first mining operation started in 1844, the same year Morse sent his famous message. By 1850, there were dozens of mining companies staking claims across the peninsula. By 1860, Michigan was producing more copper than any other state in the nation. The wilderness became a frontier, and the frontier became an industry. Men flooded into this wilderness from everywhere. From Cornwall, England, where miners had been working tin and copper for generations. Their ancestors had dug into the earth since before the Romans came. Mining was in their blood, passed from father to son for centuries. From Finland and Sweden, where harsh winters had bred people who didn't complain about hardship. From Ireland, where famine had driven millions to seek any work they could find. From Germany and Italy and Eastern Europe, from anywhere men were desperate enough to descend into the earth for wages. They came because they heard you could make real money in the copper mines. $2 a day, sometimes more. Enough to feed a family. Enough to send money back to the old country. Enough to imagine someday buying a piece of land and never going underground again. What they didn't fully understand was what that money would cost them. The first mines were relatively shallow. You could dig down a few hundred feet following the copper veins, and while it was hard work, it wasn't so different from mining anywhere else. The rock was solid, the air was breathable, the temperatures were manageable. A strong man could work 10 years in those shallow diggings and come out with his lungs still functioning, his body still whole. But the Keweenaw copper didn't stay near the surface. The veins plunged deep into the earth, following geological faults that had formed 1 billion years ago when this land was shaped by volcanic fire. The copper had been deposited by ancient hydrothermal systems, superheated water carrying dissolved metals through cracks in the basalt, precipitating pure copper as the water cooled. Those cracks ran deep, miles deep, and the miners followed them down. So the mines went deeper, 300 feet, 500 feet, 800 feet, and then 1,000 feet, and then deeper still. The Quincy mine eventually reached over 9,000 feet below the surface, measured along the incline of the shaft. The Calumet and Hecla went even deeper. These were among the deepest mines in the world at the time, pushing into regions of the earth that human beings had never entered before. At those depths, everything changed. You have to understand what it meant to go underground in the 1850s and 1860s. There were no elevators, not really. There were cages, wooden boxes suspended by cables that dropped you into the darkness. The cables were made of hemp rope in the early days, thick as a man's arm but still terrifyingly fragile when you thought about it. You'd step into this box with maybe 15 other men, and you'd feel the jolt as the hoist operator released the brake. Then you'd fall. Not fall exactly, but descend so fast your stomach rose into your throat. The walls of the shaft rushing past, lit only by the candles each man carried. Water dripping from the rock, splashing your face with drops that grew warmer as you descended. The temperature rising with every 100 feet. The air growing heavier, thicker, harder to breathe. The darkness below swallowing the faint light of your candle. The shaft wasn't vertical. Most Keweenaw shafts followed the copper veins at steep angles, maybe 60 or 70 degrees from horizontal. So you weren't dropping straight down. You were plunging into the earth at an angle, the cage sliding along rails, the rock wall inches from your face. If you reached out, you could touch the stone rushing past. If the cable snapped, you wouldn't just fall. You'd tumble and bounce down the incline until you hit the bottom. It happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. At 1,000 feet, you'd step out of that cage into a different world. The first thing you'd notice was the heat. The rock itself radiated heat at those depths, warmed by the geothermal gradient that adds roughly 1 degree of temperature for every 100 feet of depth. But in the Keweenaw, the temperatures were more extreme than geology alone could explain. Geothermal activity heated the groundwater that seeped through the rock, and that water came out hot enough to scald. Springs of near-boiling water burst from the walls without warning. Pools of hot water collected in low spots where men had to wade through, feeling the heat penetrate their boots. Miners described working in 100-degree temperatures as normal. That was baseline. On bad days, in certain parts of certain mines, it reached 130. That's not an exaggeration. That's documented in contemporary accounts. 130 degrees Fahrenheit, in an enclosed space, with no ventilation, with no way to cool down, with no escape. You worked nearly naked in that heat. A pair of canvas pants cut off at the knee, the fabric rotting from constant exposure to hot water and sulfurous air. Maybe a cotton shirt, soaked in water, that would dry within minutes, providing brief relief before the heat returned. A felt hat with a brim to hold your candle. Maybe a bandana tied over your mouth to filter some of the dust, though it didn't really help. And that was it. You'd sweat constantly. Not the normal sweating of hard labor. A continuous pour of fluid from every pore, your body desperately trying to cool itself. Miners could lose 10 pounds of water weight in a single shift. They'd drink constantly from canteens and water barrels, but they couldn't keep up with the loss. Dehydration headaches were universal. Heat exhaustion was common. Men collapsed and had to be carried to the surface, and sometimes they never came back down. The tunnels themselves were called drifts, and they followed the copper veins wherever they led. Some veins ran horizontally for hundreds of feet, allowing relatively easy work in tunnels where you could almost stand upright. Others plunged downward at steep angles, forcing miners to work on inclined surfaces where one slip meant tumbling into darkness. Some veins pinched down to mere inches, then widened again, requiring tunnels that squeezed tight enough to trap a man's shoulders. The drifts were narrow, sometimes only 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall. You couldn't stand upright in many of them. You worked bent over, your back screaming after the first hour, or crouching on your heels until your knees gave out, or lying on your side in positions that would cripple your spine over years of labor. And in those cramped, superheated tunnels, with only candlelight to see by, you drilled rock. The hand drill was a simple tool, deceptively simple. A steel rod, anywhere from 12 inches to 4 feet long, depending on how deep you needed the hole. One end was sharpened to a chisel point, hardened by repeated heating and quenching until the steel could bite into basalt. The other end was flat for striking. That was the entire technology: steel and skill and sweat. Two men worked together in a dance that required absolute trust. One held the drill against the rock face, gripping the steel rod with both hands, rotating it slightly after each blow to keep the hole round and prevent the bit from binding. The other swung a 4-pound hammer, striking the flat end of the drill with enough force to chip away the basalt. The drill holder had to trust completely that the hammerman would hit true. One miss could shatter his hands. Over and over, hour after hour, the clang of steel on steel echoing through the tunnels. A skilled team could drill maybe an inch per minute in soft rock. In hard basalt, it might take 5 minutes to advance a single inch. And you needed holes at least 18 inches deep, often 2 feet or more, to hold enough black powder to blast the rock loose. Think about that for a moment. Let it really sink in. 2 feet of hole, drilled by hand, one blow at a time. The hammerman swinging that 4-pound weight above his head in a tunnel where he couldn't stand straight, his arms burning with lactic acid after the first 100 swings, his shoulders aching, his grip weakening. The drill holder kneeling in hot water that soaked through his pants and blistered his knees, rotating the steel rod between impacts, feeling the vibration shudder up through his arms with every strike, his hands callousing and cracking. If the hammerman missed, he could shatter the drill holder's hand. It happened more than anyone wanted to admit. Men worked with mangled fingers, with crooked, healed bones that ached whenever the weather changed, with hands that could no longer grip properly. You couldn't take time off for injuries that didn't kill you. The company would replace you within the hour and your family would go hungry. They called this method single jacking, when one man did both jobs, holding the drill with one hand and swinging a lighter hammer with the other. It was slower, but it meant you didn't need a partner, didn't have to split the wages. Double jacking was when two men worked as a team, trading positions every so often to rest their arms. The best miners developed a rhythm so precise they didn't need to look. Strike, rotate, strike, rotate. The hammer coming down exactly where it needed to be, the drill turning exactly the right amount. The sound of it echoed through the tunnels, hundreds of hammers ringing against steel throughout the mine, the percussion of men tearing rock apart by hand. Old miners said they could tell who was working where just by the rhythm of the hammering. Each team had its own tempo, its own signature. And when the holes were drilled, they'd pack them with black powder. Careful work, pouring the granular explosive into the hole, tamping it down with a wooden rod. Never a metal rod, never anything that could spark. One mistake could kill everyone in the drift. Insert a fuse, a length of slow-burning cord that gave you maybe 30 seconds to run. Light it with your candle flame, and run. The blast would fill the tunnel with smoke and dust and fragments of rock. The concussion would slam through your chest even from a distance. You'd wait in a side drift while the air cleared, though it never really cleared, not fully. That dust hung in the still, hot air for hours, settling slowly, coating everything. Rock dust, powder smoke, and something else. Something nobody talked about much in those days. Silica. The basalt rock of the Keweenaw contained quartz, and quartz is essentially crystalline silica. When you drill rock, you create dust. Fine particles small enough to float in the air, small enough to penetrate deep into your lungs. And once silica particles lodge in your lung tissue, your body can't remove them. They're too hard, too chemically inert. They just sit there, irritating the tissue, causing scarring, triggering inflammation. A slow, progressive destruction of your ability to breathe. They called it miner's consumption in those days, or just miner's lung. Doctors didn't fully understand the mechanism yet, wouldn't fully understand it for decades. But the miners knew something was killing them. They could feel it. Men in their 30s, gasping for breath after climbing a flight of stairs. Men in their 40s, who couldn't walk across a room without stopping to rest. Men who coughed blood and wasted away, even after they'd left the mines. The average lifespan of a Keweenaw copper miner in the 1860s was disturbingly short. Many didn't live to see 50. Some didn't make 40. And the ones who did survive often spent their final years as invalids, their lungs too scarred to function, drowning slowly on dry land while their families watched. But they kept going down. They kept drilling, because the copper had to come out, and there was no other way to get it. If you're learning something from this, take a second to subscribe. I make documentaries about the forgotten labor that built modern infrastructure, and there's a lot more of this history to cover. Let me tell you about the light. Underground at 1,000 feet, in a tunnel carved through ancient rock, the darkness is absolute. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, not the darkness of a moonless night in the country. This is a darkness that has never known light, that has existed for 1 billion years, that feels solid, that presses against your eyes, that seems to have weight and texture. Your candle was everything. A single tallow candle, about 6 inches long, stuck to your hat brim with a lump of clay. It threw a circle of light, maybe 6 feet in diameter, flickering with every movement, casting shadows that danced on the rock walls. Beyond that circle, nothing. Just black. An absolute black that swallowed everything. The miners called that candle their best friend underground. Lose it, and you were helpless. Your eyes couldn't adjust because there was nothing to adjust to. Not the faintest glimmer of light anywhere. If your candle went out and you couldn't relight it, you had to feel your way along the tunnel walls, shuffling through hot water, hoping you were heading toward a shaft where other men might be working, where you might see the distant glow of another candle. Some men always carried extra candles. Others carried matches wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. The smart ones memorized the tunnels they worked, counting their steps, feeling the changes in the rock that told them where they were. The really smart ones made friends with men in neighboring drifts, so someone would notice if they went missing. Men died because their candles went out, got turned around in the maze of drifts and crosscuts, wandered into abandoned sections of the mine where no one had worked for years, fell down winzes, which were vertical shafts connecting different levels, sudden drops into nothing. Some bodies were never found. They're still down there, somewhere in those flooded tunnels, in the dark. The mines themselves were labyrinths. The Quincy mine eventually had over 200 miles of underground tunnels, 200 miles of drifts and crosscuts and raises and winzes, connecting dozens of different levels, following copper veins that twisted and branched and doubled back on themselves. You could get lost for days in there if you didn't know the way. And the copper veins didn't run in straight lines. The veins twisted and branched and pinched out and reappeared, following the ancient cracks in the basalt wherever they led. So the tunnels twisted with them, creating a three-dimensional maze that would confuse anyone who didn't work there daily. Miners navigated by memory, by the feel of the rock, by the faint movement of air that told them which way led toward a shaft. They learned to read the stone the way a sailor reads the sea. The good miners could smell copper. They'd tell you that with complete seriousness. After years underground, they developed a sensitivity to the metal, could walk into a drift and know whether it was worth working by the smell of the rock. But candles consume oxygen, and they produce carbon dioxide, which is heavier than air and sinks to the lowest points in the tunnels. In workings with poor ventilation, the air could become dangerous without anyone noticing until it was almost too late. Miners would feel it as a headache first, a dull pounding behind the eyes, then dizziness, a sensation that the tunnel was spinning, then a desperate need to get out, a primal alarm screaming in their brains that something was wrong. The experienced ones knew to climb, to get to higher ground where the air was better. The inexperienced ones sometimes just sat down to rest and never got up again. The water was another enemy. Groundwater seeps into every deep mine. It's unavoidable. The earth is saturated with water, held in cracks and fissures in the rock. In the Keweenaw, the water was hot, really hot. Some of it came out at temperatures near boiling. Pumping systems ran constantly, steam-powered engines on the surface driving massive pumps that lifted thousands of gallons per day from the lower levels. The Cornish pump, a design used in Cornwall for generations, became the standard. A giant wooden beam, maybe 40 feet long, rocking back and forth like a seesaw, driving pump rods down into the mine. The sound of those pumps running was the heartbeat of every Keweenaw mine. But the pumps couldn't keep up with the inflow in many mines. Water seeped in faster than it could be removed. Miners worked standing in water, sometimes up to their knees. Hot water that softened their skin until it wrinkled and peeled. Water that caused blisters and rashes and infections that wouldn't heal. In winter, when they came up from the depths, the shock was almost worse. From 120 degrees underground to 20 below zero on the surface. They'd emerge from the shaft house steaming, their wet clothes beginning to freeze before they could get inside. The walk from the mine to the boarding house could give you frostbite if you weren't careful. Now let me tell you about what they were actually after. Native copper is remarkable stuff. Most copper deposits in the world consist of copper ore, rock that contains copper compounds mixed with other minerals. You have to crush the ore into powder, then smelt it at high temperatures to separate the copper from everything else. But the Keweenaw copper was different. Here, ancient volcanic activity had deposited pure metallic copper directly into the rock. Veins of it, running through the basalt like wires through a circuit board. Chunks of it, sometimes massive boulders of solid copper weighing thousands of pounds. The purity was astonishing. 99% copper or better, some samples testing at 99.9%. Copper that pure conducts electricity better than anything else affordable. Perfect for telegraph wire. Perfect for electrical equipment. Perfect for a nation about to electrify itself. Small pieces you could pry loose with a crowbar. Medium pieces you drill around them, blast the surrounding rock away, then haul them to the surface. But the big pieces, the multi-ton masses of solid copper, required something else. They'd build fires on top of them, pile wood on the copper, set it ablaze, let the fire burn for hours. The copper would absorb heat, expand slightly, stress the bonds holding it to the surrounding rock, then throw cold water on the heated metal. The thermal shock would crack the copper into pieces small enough to handle. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company alone produced over 4 billion pounds of copper between 1866 and 1968. 4 billion pounds. Most of it pulled from the earth by hand in the decades before mechanization. That copper built America's electrical infrastructure. Telegraph lines first, strung between cities on wooden poles. Then telephone lines, spreading across the nation in the 1880s and 1890s. Then the power grid itself. Copper wire carried the current that lit homes and powered factories and ran streetcars. Every time you flip a light switch, You're connected to a chain of technology that started with men drilling rock by candlelight. The workforce came from all over the world, but two groups dominated the industry and shaped its culture in ways that lasted for generations. The Cornish were the first and most influential. They arrived in the Keweenaw knowing more about hard rock mining than anyone else on Earth. Cornwall had been a mining region for thousands of years. Cornish miners knew how to read rock, how to follow veins, how to shore up tunnels so they didn't collapse. They brought techniques developed over generations. They became the foremen and shift bosses of the early Keweenaw mines. They also brought their traditions. The pasty, that dense pocket of meat and vegetables wrapped in pastry, was Cornish through and through. Miners carried pasties into the tunnels, eating them cold during their breaks. The thick, crimped edge served as a handle, something to hold while you ate with dirty hands covered in rock dust. You didn't eat the crimp, you threw it to the knockers, the spirits of the mine, hoping to stay on their good side. The Cornish believed in those knockers with deadly seriousness. Little spirits who lived in the rock, who would knock warnings before a cave-in if they liked you, or lead you astray if they didn't. You left them offerings of food. You never whistled underground because whistling offended them. You never worked on certain days that belonged to the spirits. Mining breeds superstition. When your life depends on rock that might fall at any moment, you develop rituals, and you follow them religiously. The Finns came later, in the 1870s and 1880s, as the mines expanded and the demand for labor exceeded what the Cornish community could supply. They came from a country of forests and farms, not mines, but they learned fast. The Finns were tough in a way that impressed even the hardened Cornish. They'd grown up in a harsh climate, accustomed to cold and darkness and long hours of physical labor. They were stubborn, refusing to complain, refusing to quit even when the conditions would have broken other men. They took the positions no one else wanted, at the lowest levels where the heat was worst, in the tightest drifts where larger men couldn't fit. The ethnic divisions were sharp on the surface. Cornish in one neighborhood, Finns in another, Italians and Slavs in others still. Different churches, different languages, different saloons. But underground, nationality didn't matter much. You worked with whoever was assigned to your drift. You trusted your partner with your life because you had no choice. Subscribe if you want to keep learning about the workers' history forgot. There's a lot more to cover. The mining towns that grew up around the shafts were rough places. Hancock, Houghton, Calumet, Red Jacket. Company towns, mostly, where the mining company owned the houses, the stores, sometimes even the churches. Your paycheck went back to the company for rent, for groceries, for equipment. Some miners worked for years and never quite got ahead. The prices at the company store were higher than prices elsewhere, but elsewhere was a long walk. The rent for company housing was reasonable, but you couldn't live anywhere else and keep your job. The companies weren't entirely heartless. Some built decent housing, schools for miners' children, hospitals for the injured. The Calumet and Hecla was known for treating its workers relatively well. But relatively well still meant 12-hour shifts in deadly conditions. Still meant injuries without compensation. Still meant dying of lung disease in your 40s, while the company owners lived in Boston mansions. And the dangers went beyond silicosis. Cave-ins killed men without warning. You'd be working adrift, drilling your holes, the rhythm of the work hypnotic in its repetition, and suddenly, the ceiling would come down. The timber supports would splinter like matchsticks. Massive beams that had seemed so solid, snapping under weight they could no longer bear. Hundreds of tons of rock would crash into the space where you'd been standing just a moment before. The sound was like nothing else. A deep groaning first, then the crack of breaking wood, then a roar as the earth collapsed. Sometimes you'd hear it coming, a creaking of timber, a shifting sound from above, a shower of pebbles that shouldn't be falling. The experienced miners knew to run when they heard those sounds. They'd grab their candles and sprint down the drift, not looking back, not stopping until they reached solid ground. But sometimes there was no warning. The rock just let go, and men died where they stood. After a cave-in, rescue crews would dig toward any spaces where survivors might be trapped. It could take days, weeks. The men buried in the rubble would tap on pipes, signaling they were alive. Some were saved. Others suffocated waiting, or were crushed by subsequent collapses during the rescue. Flooding was another killer. The pumps that kept the lower levels dry were steam-powered, massive things that ran constantly. If a pump failed, water rose fast. At the deepest levels, you might have only minutes to reach the cage. Men drowned in those dark passages. Fire was rare but catastrophic. Once fire started underground, the draft from ventilation shafts could fan it into an inferno. Smoke would fill the tunnels, poisoning the air. Men would try to reach shafts, climbing through smoke, choking, falling. The death toll is impossible to calculate precisely. Records from the early decades are incomplete, but the cemeteries tell the story. Young men with Finnish names, Cornish names, Irish names, died aged 24, died aged 31, died aged 28. The year 1870 marked a turning point. Compressed air drills had been developed for railroad tunneling in the 1860s, and by the early 1870s, the technology was ready for mining. A single machine could bore a 2-foot hole in minutes, rather than the hour or more it took by hand. The mining companies saw the potential immediately. Faster drilling meant more rock blasted per shift. More rock blasted meant more copper extracted. More copper meant more profit. By the 1880s, compressed air drills were becoming standard in the major Keweenaw mines. Steam engines on the surface powered massive compressors that forced air through pipes into the depths. The miners called the air drills Widowmakers. That name wasn't a joke, it was a prophecy. The machines did drill faster, much faster, but they also generated enormous amounts of dust. The rapid-fire impact of the mechanical hammer pulverized the rock, creating clouds of fine particles that hung in the air like fog. Silicosis rates skyrocketed. Men who might have worked 20 years by hand were developing lung disease after 5 years with the machines. The faster drilling was literally killing them faster. Some miners refused to use the new drills. They'd worked hand drilling for decades. They knew the rhythm and the pace. They trusted their skills. The machines felt wrong to them, dangerous. But the companies insisted. The productivity gains were too significant to ignore, and there were always more workers willing to take the jobs of those who refused. By 1890, hand drilling in the major Keweenaw mines was largely a thing of the past. Production soared. The Calumet and Hecla was producing over 60 million pounds of copper per year by the late 1880s, more than half the copper output of the entire United States. The miners who made that production possible saw little of those fortunes. Daily wages did increase somewhat, from $1.50 in the 1850s to $2 or more by the 1880s. But the cost of living increased too, and the company towns kept their grip on workers' earnings. And the work remained brutal, even with the machines. You still descended 1,000 feet into oppressive heat. You still breathed poisoned air. You still risked cave-ins and floods and falls. The air drills were tools, nothing more. They didn't make mining safe. They just made it faster. The Great Keweenaw copper boom lasted until the early 20th century. By then, massive open-pit copper mines in the American West were coming online. Places like Butte, Montana, and Bingham Canyon, Utah. The Keweenaw mines couldn't compete. One by one, they closed. the Osceola in 1931. The Quincy suspended operations in 1931, reopened briefly during World War II, then closed for good. The Calumet and Hecla merged with other companies, finally ceased operations in 1968. The towns emptied out. Young people left for Detroit, for Chicago. The grand Victorian houses fell into disrepair. The shaft houses crumbled. The iron head frames rusted. Today, the Keweenaw Peninsula is quiet. The forests have reclaimed the land. The old mine sites are historical parks where tourists descend a few levels and listen to guides explain how mining worked. The guides don't take you to the deepest levels. Those are flooded now. The pumps shut down decades ago. But the copper those men extracted is still with you. The electrical wiring in your walls, the motors in your appliances, the circuit boards in your phone. Every electron that powers your modern life flows through copper. Some might be from Arizona or Chile or Zambia, but the infrastructure that made electrical technology possible, the first networks of wire that connected American cities, that was Keweenaw copper. Pulled from 1,000 feet underground by men who never saw electrical light themselves. Let me tell you about one more thing: the Italian Hall disaster. On Christmas Eve, 1913, the miners of the Keweenaw were on strike. They'd walked off the job in July, demanding recognition of their union, the Western Federation of Miners. They demanded better pay, shorter hours, an end to the one-man drill that forced a single worker to operate those Widowmaker machines alone, instead of having a partner to share the burden and watch his back. For 6 months, they'd held out, while the companies brought in replacement workers and strikebreakers, while state militia patrolled the streets with rifles, while families grew hungry and children went without. The union organized a Christmas party for the striking miners' families at the Italian Hall in Calumet, a celebration to keep spirits up, to remind the children that even in hard times, there could be joy. 700 people crowded into the second-floor hall. Children mostly, the sons and daughters of Finnish miners, Italian miners, Slavic miners. They were waiting for Santa Claus to arrive with presents. Someone shouted fire. There was no fire. Someone shouted it anyway. The crowd panicked, surged toward the stairs. The stairway was steep and narrow. People fell. Others fell on top of them. In the crush at the bottom of that stairway, 73 people died. Most of them were children. The youngest was 6 years old. No one knows who shouted fire. Some believed it was a company thug. Witnesses described a man wearing a Citizens Alliance button. Others thought it was a tragic accident. The truth died in that stairwell. The strike collapsed shortly after. The miners went back to work, defeated. The union never got recognition. The one-man drill stayed. And 73 families buried their dead in frozen ground, in a mining town that would be abandoned within a generation. This is what American industry was built on. Not just machines and capital and entrepreneurial vision. Labor. Physical, dangerous, often deadly labor, performed by people whose names you'll never learn, whose graves you'll never visit. The copper in your walls carries that history. Every wire, every cable, every circuit connects you to those tunnels 1,000 feet below the surface of a peninsula most Americans couldn't find on a map. The next time your lights come on, think about what that electricity costs. Not in dollars, in human lives, in years shaved off by silicosis, in children orphaned by cave-ins, in communities built around extraction and abandoned when the extraction ended. That's the debt we owe. And acknowledging it, remembering it, refusing to let their stories be forgotten, that's the only payment we can make now. The men who drilled copper by hand in the Keweenaw mines weren't heroes in any conventional sense. They didn't choose those jobs out of patriotism or dedication to progress. They chose them because they needed to eat, to house their families, to to survive in a country that offered few alternatives. But what they accomplished was remarkable nonetheless. They descended into conditions that would break most people today. They worked by candlelight in temperatures that should have been lethal. They breathed poison air and drank contaminated water, and watched their friends die. And they kept going back, shift after shift, year after year, until their bodies gave out, or the copper ran dry, or the mines closed and the towns died. The Keweenaw copper boom lasted roughly 80 years. In that time, those mines produced over 10 billion pounds of pure copper, enough to wire cities, to connect a continent, to build the electrical foundation of modern life. That's their legacy. Not statues or street names or chapters in textbooks, just copper. In your walls, in your devices, in everything that runs on electricity. Next time you charge your phone, think of them. The men 1,000 feet down, swinging hammers in the dark, breathing rock dust, working by the light of a single candle. They built this world. The least we can do is remember how. If this resonated with you, subscribe. I cover the labor history that made modern infrastructure possible, the workers who built what we take for granted. There's always more to learn, and these stories deserve to be told.